Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, How Employee Engagement Can Reduce Presenteeism and Absenteeism in the Workplace. My name is Natalie Varanya, and I am the Marketing Specialist here at TalentMap, and I will be your webinar host today. For today's presentation, we have David Ang, Vice President of Engagement and Consulting here at TalentMap. David is a seasoned market research professional and management consultant. He brings over 25 years of consulting experience to help TalentMap clients better understand their workforce and improve employee engagement. Over the years, David has worked with a range of clients from private sector to nonprofit and government organizations. His extensive research and consulting background has enriched his abilities in building effective client survey strategies, facilitating focus groups and workshops, and executive presentations. Welcome, David.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So for today's agenda, once I'm done with the formal introductions, David will start us off with an intro to absenteeism and presenteeism. So he'll be defining what those two words mean. We'll look at the causes and consequences of absenteeism and presenteeism. And then he'll also look at what HR professionals can do to reduce behaviors associated with presenteeism and absenteeism in the workplace. And at the end, we'll reserve the last 20 minutes for some Q&A. So before we jump in, I wanted to give everyone a quick overview of TalentMap. For those who are not familiar with us, TalentMap is a trusted advisor in employee engagement and surveying. We've been in business for over 18 years, and in those years, we have conducted more than 7,000 employee engagement projects. Each year, we survey over 1 million employees across more than 500 organizations. And we have one focus, and that is to partner with organizations to improve their workplaces. So we do this using 3 core elements. First, we ensure you ask the right questions, whether you're launching a full employee engagement survey, a pulse survey, entry-exit survey, or even a 360-degree feedback program. And then secondly, we uncover valuable employee insights by diving deep into the data and really analyzing your results. And lastly, what makes TalentMap truly unique among our sea of competitors is that we stick it out and we make sure you act on your survey results to make real change in your workforce through effective action planning and additional post-survey consulting services. So from the sample, you can see that we've worked with a number of clients across North America in a number of sectors. And with our years of experience, we have established comprehensive industry benchmarks to help put our clients' survey results in the context of their competitive marketplace. And so now that you all know a little bit about TalentMap, I'll pass it over to David.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Let's start the discussion or the presentation about absenteeism and presenteeism and define what it is. And let's start with, why this topic? Why is it of interest? And let's do that with, something that might belie my age. For those of you who are of the younger generation, you might not be as familiar with Dilbert, who is legendary in the workplace. And I think this caption here, is a good representation of how a lot of us feel at work, certainly at some point during our careers, in terms of the expectations that our bosses have of us and the workplace and so on. And it can lead to a lot of stress, and it can lead to, in a lot of situations, mental illness, if you will, caused by stress, which isn't healthy, which ultimately can lead to absenteeism and presenteeism. So, pointy-haired boss here, I think, is someone most of us have probably encountered at some point in our career if you've been in the workforce long enough. So what is absenteeism and what is presenteeism? I think probably most of you are quite familiar with the term absenteeism. It really is what the word says it is. It's not being at work. The difference from, you or I missing a day of work, to tend to something is absenteeism refers to the habitual absence from work. And it has impacts, negative impacts, to your organization, to the business. The obvious one is productivity and in terms of ability to get the work done. But then there's financial consequences. There could be quality and safety issues as well if, for example, the right number of people aren't at the office or at the plant to do the work, and it puts a strain on everyone else. And ultimately, it can have impacts on employee morale if colleagues and peers see that certain people are missing a lot of work for whatever reason. Presenteeism, which maybe you're not quite as familiar with, or may not be quite as familiar with, is something a little bit different. It refers to the situation when employees show up for work. They're physically there. They physically come into the office or the work site, but they may not be emotionally there, so to speak. So they're coming in and physically present, but they're not as productive, they're not as focused, and there could be other adverse effects if they're coming in because they're physically or mentally ill, and we'll talk about what some of the consequences of presenteeism is. So really the absenteeism is not showing up, presenteeism is actually showing up, but if you use the old cliche, showing up in body but not in mind or spirit. So there are real and true costs to presenteeism and absenteeism. There's been a lot of research, especially around absenteeism, and there's lots of metrics in terms of dollar terms and lost days and so on. So one study out of the US shows that there's typically 4 days lost to absenteeism. This is across all industries, all sectors. The estimate is that there's 57.5 days lost to presenteeism. And that would be in terms of productivity because the people are actually in the office or at their work site. So, significantly bigger impact in terms of presenteeism when we compare it to absenteeism. Even though absenteeism, I think, gets a lot more of the focus, typically speaking. The situation in Canada is no different. There's been some studies that have looked at it from, for example, the Conference Board of Canada estimates that lost productivity from absenteeism totals about $16 billion a year. Statistics Canada reports that on average about 8.4 days, I think, is the number of absent days from work across all industries. That does vary by sector, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And that trend has actually been creeping up. So some big numbers around absenteeism, a little less definitive around presenteeism. However, all the research points to presenteeism being a much, much larger issue than absenteeism. Some estimates show it as much as 7.5 times greater than absenteeism. So some very big numbers, so some very big consequences to both absenteeism and presenteeism. So let's look at the causes of these two phenomena and what's driving this. And as I mentioned, the numbers are creeping up over time. So it is definitely an issue that needs to be looked at and understood and dealt with moving forward by virtually all organizations. So there's a multitude of reasons for absenteeism. I think a lot of them would be common sense when you think about them, when you look at them. Bullying and harassment, for example, if employees feel intimidated heading into the office or their workspace, they're more likely to skip out, just to avoid that. Burnout, stress, and low morale. I think that's one that's intuitive. If employees are feeling stretched, again, they may be looking to take days off and so on. One that's growing, especially in North America and a lot of developed Western world countries, is elder care. The flip side to that is child care. So there's this situation where you need to take care of either children or your parents, so on, and because of that, usually health-related with the elder care, you're required to drop out of work for days at a time and so on, which puts a big burden on the organization as well as on the individual personally. Depression is actually identified by the National Institutes of Mental Health in the U.S. as being the #1 cause of absenteeism in the U.S. So that's a big one. Disengagement is interesting. As Natalie mentioned, we're an engagement firm, and disengagement where employees have lost the commitment to the work, to their jobs, to their colleagues, have lost that connection because they're not motivated anymore, may choose to skip coming into work on certain days. And then there's other obvious ones like being ill, being injured, if you're out constantly looking for different work, having to go to interviews and so on. And that could also drive absenteeism. And finally, shift work. If you've got a 3-4 hour shift, you might come in a bit late, leave a little bit early. That adds up and does count towards absenteeism. Presenteeism is a little bit different in terms of the main reasons. Some of them are similar in terms of, for example, illness or being sick, where some people may do the right thing and not show up, but others may not want to be viewed as missing work because they have a bad cold or something of that nature. So they come into the office even though they're not feeling anywhere close to 100%. And I think most of us have probably done that at some point in our careers. Other reasons for presenteeism, a lot of it is, and we'll talk about this later, is culture. The employer has certain expectations. It's, face time's valued, being seen to be at your desk all day is valued, working through being ill is a sign of strength, that sort of thing. So the employer expectation is different. Workload, many of us are inundated with work and you feel that you just don't have the time to take the day off, even though you might be feeling only 50%. And rather than staying home and getting better, you come in and try to work through it because the workload's too heavy. Workaholism, I think certainly I think most of us probably know colleagues that are workaholics. They love their work. They live and breathe their work. And no matter how they're feeling, no matter what the circumstance, they're going to put that time in, even if it's unproductive time. We'll talk about self-esteem. Some people define themselves through their work, and so by not coming into an office, not coming into the work site, it impinges on their own self-worth. And finally, an important one is job security. And I would think that this is certainly one that is more sector specific. So if you feel that I call in sick today and don't show up, I may lose a job, or I may not get called back, for the next shift, then you're likely to come in and provide that face time, even if you're completely unproductive. So these are some of the causes of presenteeism. I'm going to look at a few of the presenteeism reasons in more detail now. I'm not going to do the same for absenteeism because I think they're a little bit more obvious than presenteeism. So the focus in the next few slides are really going to be around presenteeism. So let's look at the first one: workload and job demands. So how does this feed into presenteeism? Well, I think a lot of employees, a lot of staff feel that they absolutely need to be in the office or their work site. Doesn't matter if they're feeling sick or if they've got an injury, and that's driven by increasing workloads, I think, many of us have gone through, restructuring and that sort of thing, where people have been cut back and the work just keeps piling up, and everyone's expected to be more productive, put in the time to get things done. So I think that has a big impact on presenteeism. Deadlines. If you're in the consulting business like I am, a lot of what we do is deadline driven. Some things due to a client on, let's say, Monday of next week. Even if I don't feel well or don't feel that I'm very productive, I know that I have to meet that deadline, so I'm going to keep going. Talked about cutbacks in terms of staffing. There's no backup support. If I don't come in, work's not going to get done. It just piles up. So I think the current environment, and especially over the past, several years, the way companies and organizations have restructured and put an increasing onus on employees to do more, workload and job demands have certainly contributed to the phenomenon of presenteeism. Ease of replacement is one that is more down to the employee rather than the pressures from the employer. So, the individual feeling that things will fall apart if I'm not there. I have to do this because it's my job. Nobody else can pick this up. That feeling that you're irreplaceable, and that if you're not there and you don't contribute, you're letting your colleagues down, you're letting your clients down. So you put pressure on yourself to come in and put in the time, even if you really shouldn't be, for either mental or physical reasons. Talked about workaholism. I think this is one a lot of us can relate to. Colleagues, parents, siblings that we know that are workaholics. These are people who are compulsive, have to put the time in. They live and breathe their work. There's been lots of research on this as well. Workaholics are not necessarily more productive. In often case, they're not, because you do need balance in your life to be able to be more productive. Burnout levels are also higher. Satisfaction levels are lower. So there's reasons to not promote workaholism in the workplace, or if you see it, to have that discussion with your employees about the negatives of that type of perspective towards work. Talked about self-esteem. There's something called performance-based self-esteem, and it's tied really to, again, this is back to the individual. It's tied to how you value your own self-worth, and that it's tied to your performance and tied to your work. And, a lot of this is driven into our kids. I have school-age kids at the moment, and, things like performance, you perform well means you're competent, means you're a high performer and you're doing great. So that's ingrained, I think, in most of us, that, that chain of performance equals competence drives self-esteem. So, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but taken to the extreme, it can lead to presenteeism, because everything you do is tied up. Your self-worth is tied up in your work and your performance. And, what we need to realize is that if you're physically or mentally not performing at the levels you should be or expected of you, you're actually counterproductive to this concept. Just being there, in terms of, if you think back to what is presenteeism, just being in the office or being at your work site, but not being productive, not being able to deliver what you need to, is actually counterproductive to performance-based self-esteem. I mentioned earlier that absenteeism, presenteeism rates are not necessarily similar in every industry, and again, research has been done looking at this by sector and so on, and absenteeism and presenteeism rates tend to be higher in, let's put it, high-touch type environments like social services, healthcare, education, these rates tend to be a fair bit higher. Also in the public sector, the rates are higher, as well as unionized environments versus those that are non-unionized. Just an interesting fact, 80% of respondents in a healthcare study said that they've shown, that they have worked while they've been physically ill. Again, that's the impact of presenteeism. So what are the consequences? We've talked about what it is, why it happens, and the financial and organizational implications in terms of dollars and days lost. But there are other consequences. There's both personal and organizational costs or consequences, if you will. So on the personal side, obviously there's the medical challenges that people face and that need to be addressed. And then on the business side, there's, it really relates down to productivity at the end of the day. So in terms of absenteeism, what are some of the actual consequences and costs? So there's the wages that you have to pay. Just because somebody, unless you fire them, because somebody's missing days, you're still paying them their wages typically. If you know that these people are absent regularly, you may have to bring in replacement workers or pay those that are actually there overtime or bringing temp workers. So there's replacement costs. There's administrative costs from an HR perspective of managing absenteeism. You might be doing more interviews, more sit-downs with employees about why this is happening. The product service quality of your organization may suffer. Also because those that are remaining are probably stretched now. We talked about productivity, manager time, similar to administrative costs, but managers have to be more involved. Safety may be compromised, and ultimately I did talk about morale being impacted by those who are not there do have an impact on those that remain, for a variety of reasons. Consequences of presenteeism, I think a big one is down to the health, because one of the main reasons for presenteeism is health. And you have unhealthy employees coming in. So apart from the productivity impact, that an unhealthy employee is likely not performing at 100% or even close to 100%, there's the risk of contagion. There's one example that when I was preparing for this, that I read that fast food chain in the U.S. had an unhealthy employee came in, a sick employee, ended up infecting 400 of the customers who bought the food at the fast food chain, who ended up, with things like severe vomiting and diarrhea. I mean, that is not something that you want to happen, strictly because of presenteeism. We talked about morale similar to absenteeism. Presenteeism, if people, a little different from absenteeism, but if you're coming into your office and you notice that 2 or 3 of your colleagues are there, but are not really there, they're just physically there, that can spread. That kind of let's call it a negative environment can spread, and that's not good. Safety issues as well. Workers that are not physically or mentally well may not be as focused, as careful, as diligent in doing their work, could lead to safety issues. And then there's lack of progress as well, both professionally and personally. If an individual is subject to the tenets of presenteeism that I talked about, they're likely not going to be developing themselves professionally as quickly as they should be. So what can we do about absenteeism and presenteeism? It's a complicated issue. It's obviously not, wave a magic wand and we'll solve this, or it would have been done. And it's, and while it's a major issue and a pervasive issue, it's actually very hard to deal with. So I'm going to talk about a few things that you might want to consider, sort of at a high level, at a broad level. So let's start with the fact that a lot of the stress that results in both absenteeism and presenteeism is culture induced when we talk external stress. So I'm not talking about someone being physically ill or so on. We're talking about the face time culture that I mentioned earlier. The need to be, some organizations, some bosses don't believe that employees are working if they can't see them. So they discourage working at home or teleworking, that sort of thing. Tacit support for workaholism and compulsive working. I've worked in an organization where, that you get the pat on the back if you're seen there working till, 9 o'clock at night. It's like, wow, this person works hard. That's what we want. The recognition for that. They're working even while they're sick. What a character. These types of cultural constructs need to be broken down if you're to address absenteeism and presenteeism on a broad scale. And really that comes from senior management. It's top-down driven. Employees at all levels will fall in line with the culture set by the senior leadership of the firm or the organization. So that's something to think about in terms of one way to mitigate absenteeism and presenteeism. Let's look at some of the other things that can be done that are, I think, important steps that could address this issue. So the first thing is recognize if it's a problem in your organization. And that seems trite, but it's easy to overlook if everyone's busy and especially in large organizations where it can get lost, in the flow of business, day-to-day business. A big one is how you actually, and this is more to address presenteeism, but how you deal with absenteeism. So if there's programs in place or the policy is reprimands and disciplinary, sort of harsh disciplinary actions, that can actually drive presenteeism, because employees may feel intimidated or fearful of taking a day off, even if they're legitimately ill or sick, or legitimately have to go and attend to some other important aspect of their life, because they don't want to be reprimanded or docked salary or whatever that is, the program may be. So I think you need to look at your absenteeism policy and make sure that it's not driving presenteeism, which, as we've talked about already, has a lot of unintended consequences, that may not be apparently obvious. In terms of presenteeism, so you might want to develop an actual policy around it. I think most employers do have policies around, days off and how to deal with absent employees, but maybe not so much in terms of presenteeism. And I think a good start is educating employees on what presenteeism is, so that they can themselves identify when they're falling into it. Because as mentioned, it's not always just a physical reason to be present, but not productive. There are many other reasons, and it would be helpful if employees themselves understood and could self-identify when they're falling into that trap. Don't set a bad example yourself. If you're sick, not feeling well, don't come in. As a leader, as HR, employees will take cues from you. If they see that that's accepted and expected behavior, they're going to do the same. We talked about disciplinary action in terms of absenteeism, but on the other side of it, once those policies and programs have been laid out and communicated properly, for example, if you're sick, don't come in, and people break and constantly break those rules, there has to be consequences for the action. So that it sets the foundation for everyone else to know what's acceptable and what's not. Somebody does come in and they're sick, send them home. If they're sick enough, they're sick but still not that sick that they can't work, let them work from home. Option of telecommuting, option from working at home. Empower them to do that. Make them comfortable to feel that they can work at home. Actually have a paid sick leave, paid time off policy for employers and workers. I think this is more common in Canada. In the US, I think it's a lot less common in terms of paid sick leave. So employees feel that if they are sick, that they can take it off, and also perhaps throw in, personal days. A lot of organizations have those as well. So you get 5 or 7 sick days a year, and you're also provided, an additional 2 or 3 quote unquote personal days. So, if you have childcare, elder care that you need to take care of, you can use those days, and perhaps think about allowing employees to carry it over from one year, so employees don't feel that they need to burn them each year, even if they're not, really sick. Oh, I'm just going to take a sick day because, it's there. If they're allowed to carry it forward, then they have the understanding that if something serious does come up, let's say in 2019 or 2020, I've got bank days that I can rely on to help me through it. And a former company I worked with did that very well. I can give you an example. So there was an employee I knew. She was actually a vice president, and she hadn't taken sick days in many, many years, didn't need them. And then she was unfortunately diagnosed with cancer at one point. And she had banked up, so many sick days over the, 30 years of being at the company that she was actually able to take several months off without consequence financially, and then kick into disability while she went through treatments on, and she's fully recovered, thankfully, but it was a very good policy in place. So things like that. And finally, employee morale. If employees are motivated, engaged, and morale is high, they are less likely to suffer from either absenteeism or presenteeism. So let's end. I'm going to end the session with the connection between absenteeism, presenteeism, and engagement. Because there's a bit of what we'll call an uneasy relationship between these different aspects of work. So before I get into that very, very quickly, and this is a very short section, a quick refresher if you haven't had a chance to think about engagement lately, or perhaps this is new information for you if you're new to engagement. So engagement really is, if you look at the chart here, or the illustration, engagement really, if you look at it, it's what's shown on the right-hand side in terms of it's a different type of behavior that the employee has. And it's driven by both the cognitive or the logical side of work in terms of, what am I paid? Do I have good benefits? All the very practical, rational type of aspects of work, as well as the emotional connection, alignment that you have with your employer and with your colleagues and with your managers, so on, and your clients. When you take the two together, what you do is you get an employee that behaves differently. And when I say behaves differently, it's really the employee that has a two-way relationship with their employer. So what does the employer do for me as an employee, but what am I willing to give back to my employer and to my colleagues and so on? And the key thing here is that it's what am I willing to give back on a voluntary basis, on a discretionary basis. And so it's very much about, being an ambassador for your employer, taking initiative. One of the common things we say is, A highly engaged employee often is willing to, quote unquote, go the extra mile, put in that extra effort because they're engaged, because they feel that commitment. They do things like that. So how does that relate to absenteeism and presenteeism? So we do a lot of research, as Natalie said, over 500 studies a year with different clients, literally thousands of studies over the years, millions of respondents. And so we look at all kinds of dimensions of work and how they relate to engagement. And one of the interesting things that we find is work-life balance, which I've circled there, which is, one of the key things that, one of the key components of presenteeism and absenteeism. So if the work-life balance is really bad, it has an impact on absenteeism and presenteeism. And what we found is that there's a bit of an inverse relationship between engagement and work-life balance. So highly engaged employees often have poor work-life balance. Because they're engaged, they put in that extra effort, that extra time, that extra commitment to their employer and to their teams and to their colleagues and clients. It's at the expense of their personal life quite often, which is in the short run okay, but in the long run will result in absenteeism and presenteeism because of things like burnout, mental fatigue, even physical fatigue and illness. You can't keep up that level of intensity over the very, very long run without consequences. And so high engagement tends to lead to poorer work-life balance outcomes, and poorer work-life balance outcomes tends to result in higher degrees of absenteeism and presenteeism. So there's a little bit of a challenging dynamic that, we strive for strong engagement, highly engaged organizations and highly engaged employees because there are a plethora of very good business, organizational reasons to do so. And even from an employee perspective, there's a lot of very good reasons to do so. But it's a matter of balance, ultimately, because while we strive and push for high engagement, we have to keep an eye on work-life balance because it will tip the scales in that direction towards negative work-life balance if we're not careful. And ultimately, you may have the most engaged employee, but they may suffer from burnout and will end up suffering from absenteeism, presenteeism, or worst case, will just leave and you lose a valuable employee. So it's really about balance. It's really about driving engagement, but also keeping an eye on what is causing potential absenteeism and presenteeism in your workforce and coming up with solutions, hopefully some of which I've shared, you might be able to build on and build out for your own organizations if you haven't already done so. And on that note, that's all I'm going to talk to today. I'll pass it back to Natalie for any comments or questions that you may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. That was really great insight on what seemed to be a much more complex issue than I even expected. So for everyone still on the line, if you haven't submitted a question, please feel free to do so now. And while more questions come in, I just wanted to mention a few other things. So we've been working very hard here at TalentMap to provide additional resources for our clients and our followers. We regularly post new articles on our blog each week that provide quick tips, tricks, and a look at industry trends, as well as some thought leadership pieces to keep you in the loop in terms of HR trends. So we have also recently built a resource library where you can find even more content, more in-depth content pieces, including downloadable how-to guides, some checklists, and info sheets to help guide your employee engagement or general HR initiatives. We also have some upcoming TalentMap events and learning sessions. So we have our next webinar. It takes place August 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on how to recruit, engage, and retain the right talent with employer branding. So we have a special guest joining us for this webinar. His name is John from Pivot and Edge. Pivot and Edge is an expert in employer branding and recruitment to help organizations consistently find great people. So a link to register will be sent along with today's presentation slides and recording early next week. And then for our other upcoming events, later this year we'll be at the OBJ, Ottawa Business Journal Networking Golf Tournament, as well as NHRMA's 80th Annual Conference and Trade Show in Tacoma, Washington, and the OMAA Fall Workshop in Muskoka, Ontario in October. So if you're attending any of these events, please let us know. We'd love to meet you face to face. Okay. Perfect. So we'll jump into questions at this time. We have a couple that have come in. So one is from Leslie. Her question is, how do you address workload in general? What number of hours a week or a range of hours is reasonable to work full time?
So, that's an interesting question. And, I think if we look at number of hours worked, it's been declining in a lot of jurisdictions. So I think in France, for example, I think the standard work week is now under 35 hours a week. In Canada, it's somewhere between 35 and 40, and in parts of Asia and so on, it's well over 40. So I think there's no cut. And I'm sorry to say this, I don't think there's a cut and dry answer in terms of what is the right number of hours per week in terms of workload. I think really it comes down to a couple of things. One is it really does depend on the sector you're in and the type of work that you're doing. So for example, if someone working in a factory, on a production line, 40 hours a week or 45 hours a week might be okay. They're getting paid for every hour that they're there, and when they leave, they're done. For someone, for example, let me give an example of clients I've worked with in, for example, financial services or consulting. The standard work week might be 36 and a half hours, but realistically, because the work is fluid and they're responding to deadlines and requests and so on and so forth, while they may log 36 and a half hours on their timesheet, they might actually be working 50 or 60 hours to get things done in a week. So I think, as HR or as an employer, you need to look at, more than just the standard work week, but you need to look at what are people actually doing and what's the expectation that's put on them. And this is where I think, while technology has been great, technology has also really created a lot of pressure and especially mental pressure for employees. The 24/7, 365-day connectivity on your smartphone, for example, that the boss expects to be able to reach you on weekends, at night, even if you're on vacation because you've got a smartphone, that puts an undue amount of pressure on an employee. That they're always connected and always feel that pressure and that stress of work, even though technically they might not be at work. And that can definitely lead to things like absenteeism and presenteeism.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And then we have one more question. This one comes from Terry. His question is that it seems that presenteeism behaviors, they seem to be driven by personality traits. So as you mentioned, performance-based self-esteem and workaholic nature. But by getting in the way of what drives them, could that cause disengagement? And do you have suggestions to avoid that feeling of disengagement while addressing these behaviors?
Right, and I think that's a really good question. So something like workaholism and self-worth, if that's what's driving them and they remain very productive, then that's actually not an issue in terms of presenteeism. Because if you think about, why should you be concerned about presenteeism? health reasons side, but we're talking more about the motivation right now. The reason that you want to discourage presenteeism is because it's ultimately poor productivity. You're there physically, but you're not really contributing as much as you could if you were, let's say, fresh of mind. So if you are a workaholic or you're driven by, PBSC, but you're able to maintain your high levels of productivity and deliver what you're expected, then that's okay. That's not presenteeism. It's the situation where the workaholic gets burnt out because they're working 70 hours a week, 60 hours a week, and they're under stress, and they want to do it, but there's a point where you can't. So I think when you notice that that's happening, you need to have a conversation with them and help them understand that, it's similar to, if you use a sports analogy, and I'm a big sports guy, it's, you pick up a knock or an injury and you're like, I can still play. Yeah, you can still play, and you get back on the field or the ice or the pitch. But, you're not nearly as good as you are when you're 100% fit. It's better, I play soccer, so, you get a slight calf strain or hamstring, and you're like, yeah, I can still go, but, I can't sprint as much as I would normally. So, yeah, you're on the pitch, but you're not contributing, and you might actually be hurting the team. It might be better for you to take that 2 weeks off, recover 100%, come back at full stretch, even though you're dying to be on the pitch. It's the same kind of thing with workaholism or PBSC. As long as they're fresh and able to contribute, then that's fine. But at some point, they will get burnt out, and it's just about having that conversation with them and letting them understand that there's nothing wrong with going and refreshing yourself so you can come back at 100% and move on from there.
Awesome. That was a really good analogy, I think. So those are all of the questions, actually, we have today. So thank you to those who submitted questions. If you do have any additional questions or follow-up questions, David and my contact information is on the screen, so feel free to reach out at any time, and we'd be happy to have a discussion. So as a reminder, before we end the webinar, I just wanted to say that the recording of the webinar and slide deck will be posted on the TalentMap website early next week, and we'll be sure to email you directly once it's available. And so that's it for our presentation today. Thank you, David, for taking the time to present, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. We hope you'll join us.
Yeah,
again.
Thank you very much for your time, for calling in today. Bye-bye.
Alrighty. Bye for now.